Hello, this is Richie Venton, the Scottish Socialist Party trade union organiser. There's an old cliche about two bald men fighting over a comb, signifying a battle over nothing of substance. Last night we had the head-to-head debate between Sir Keir Starmer and billionaire Rishi Sunak. Now, whilst neither of them are bald, in the language of my home county, Fermanagh, then the two of them are baldly liars when it comes to what they're offering the public if either of them becomes Prime Minister. Because what they're really battling over is which of the two would become the next Tory Prime Minister. What they're both battling over is which of them would carry out a programme of austerity against the working class. Of course, Starmer denies that they're going to carry out austerity, but the facts of the matter include that the debt in the state, public sector debt, is £2.3 trillion. So how are they going to tackle that if they're not going to reconstruct the economy on a planned basis with socialist measures that protect both people and the planet, a socialist Green New Deal, to use a label, which of course has got nothing to do with what Labour intends. The reality is, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies have reported, that they will have to carry out some version of austerity, whether that be in the form of tax increases on ordinary people, because they're not going to tax the rich. They've made that very clear. They're not going to implement a wealth tax. They're not going to increase corporation tax on their profits. So where would they raise the taxes? It would be on ordinary working class people. Or, if they don't increase taxes, then they're going to slash public expenditure to a gargantuan level, particularly in those areas that are not statutory and obligatory on them to carry out. And what in this highlights is the fact that there's an increased convergence between the policies of the Tory party and the Labour Party. That's not a new thing. Because, for example, when Tony Blair became the leader of the Labour Party, that's precisely one of the trends that some of us identified and led us to establish the Scottish Socialist Party. That Labour had become the new Tories, that in the words of Tony Blair, he converted Labour into the equivalent of the American Democrats, just another equivalent capitalist party. And in fact, he was famously involved in dumping Clause 4, Part 4, which called for common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange. He dumped the democracy of the Labour Party, and then in turn, whilst in government for 13 years, Labour's record proves the fact that they were precisely the new Tories, with the way that the increased levels of inequality to the highest level since Victorian times, according to Oxfam. They continued with the anti-union laws that Thatcher and others had introduced, and so on. Now, the danger, which has been there for at least 30 years or thereabouts, is that this convergence between those two major parties in Britain opens up a vacuum where the discontent of the population, the feeling of they're all the same, they're all indistinguishable, what's the difference, what do they do for us? The danger is that that vacuum is created for the emergence not just of a left-wing socialist alternative, which of course we're fighting to establish, but also the danger of a right-wing populist set of demagogues. And that danger is more present now than it was 25, 30 years ago, because we see the way in which the vicious racist Nigel Farage has stepped into the fray in the context of people being utterly sickened by the lack of choice between Labour and the Tories. Now, Farage is a complete fake. He's a complete hypocrite. He's a former banker who was involved in the stock exchange and so on, making a fortune for himself. He's somebody who spouts against the right to immigration, even though he used to be married to a German woman. He's somebody who is involved in destructive, hostile politics towards migrants, people that are desperately coming into the country out of persecution and wars that quite often as Britain has been conducting, or just coming here out of poverty, seeking a new and better life. And it's both vicious towards people of colour, but it's also the politics of distraction, because it avoids the root cause of issues, like, for example, what is going to be offered to those born in this country by way of inducement to work. Because if the conditions are so rotten that nobody wants to take the job, then the cure is to improve the conditions. But there's absolutely no suggestion of that coming from the likes of Farage any more than from Sunak or Starmer. And so therefore, what we need to try and combat is the emergence of the far right. Now, at this stage, I don't think it's in any way as big a danger in Scotland. But having said that, I don't think we can just assume there'll never be the rise of a far right populist demagogue who's trying to distract people from the real solutions, here in Scotland included. So what do we do? And I think what we have to first of all recognise is that people need to really be woken up to the fact that just because they're hungry to get rid of a Tory Prime Minister, they're desperate to do so, and I share that desire. They shouldn't therefore be fooled into electing another Tory Prime Minister who's just had a bit of spray paint in Labour's palest pink, because that's what Starmer amounts to. People should beware of false friends of the working class, because, of course, Keir Starmer is fond of talking about how his father was a tool maker. Some would reply, well, the living proof that he was a tool maker is the fact that his son is Keir Starmer. But on the other hand, others claim that his father was actually the owner of the factory that was a tool-making establishment. I don't know. But the main point, regardless of the personal background, is the fact that Keir Starmer presides over a centralised dictatorship in the Labour Party, which has abandoned all previous promises of substantial change. They've abandoned nationalisation of the water in England at a time when people are swimming literally in sewage. They've abandoned nationalisation of Royal Mail that was previously promised under Jeremy Corbyn at the time when the billionaire Czech wrecker is taking over Royal Mail and threatening the universal service obligation of delivery of letters and parcels, threatening the workforce, threatening the age-old service. They've abandoned abolition of tuition fees for students down south and have actually talked about how they want to equalise or harmonise conditions in Scotland, which might suggest that a Labour government in the future, especially if they went on to become a Labour government in Scotland, would maybe consider abolishing the free tuition in Scotland as well. They've abandoned any previous talk of nationalisation of energy at a time when people are being ripped off big style by billionaire energy companies and suffering fuel poverty during the winter. And of course, they've also made clear, very clear, to use the jargon of the politicians, they're always very clear when they're trying to cover something up, but they have been clear at the fact that they're going to privatise even more of the National Health Service. So then Labour tried to portray themselves as the friend of working people by the so-called New Deal for workers. But already we've seen what they're going to be about in a Starmer Labour government. They refused to repeal the Public Order Act, which bans protests. For example, it was used to lift people who had been protesting against the coronation of King Charles, going around in bejewelled carriages at a time when people couldn't afford to travel in public transport. And the excuse given by David Lammy, leading Labour spokesperson, was that it would take up too much parliamentary time, that Labour cannot come into office picking through all Conservative legislation and repealing it. That's his exact quote. Now, that shows a contempt for people's civil liberties, but also is an alarming signpost as to what Labour will do to workers' rights as such when or if they get into government. We've already seen the retreats on the New Deal for workers, on things like zero contracts. For a while they used the expression that they would abolish zero contracts. The weasel words of abolish exploitative zero contracts have increasingly been used by Keir Starmer, Anna Sarwar and others. And I would challenge Sarwar, does that mean that you're telling openly to the public that you will keep many workers chained in this modern form of slavery? Because that's the reality. I fought for removal of that deceptive expression about banning exploitative zero contracts. I successfully fought against that in my own union, OSDAW, because at the 2018 OSDAW National Conference, I proposed a policy that all zero contracts should be abolished because they're all exploitative. They should all be banned and replaced by a guaranteed minimum 16-hour week for every worker that wants that. That was passed unanimously at that conference, and then in turn became the policy of the Scottish TUC when I proposed it at the 2019 STUC Congress. It was passed without opposition at that Congress. And now the fake friends of the trade union movement in the form of Anna Sarwar is retreating on that by saying, well, we'll only abolish exploitative zero contracts. They're all exploitative. People should waken up to what's been threatened under a Labour government on that front. And of course, we shouldn't be surprised at this retreat from any real establishment of full workers' rights on the part of Labour. Because if you take a few steps back in history, even old Labour, let alone new Labour and Starmer's new continuity Tories, every stage of Labour history, without having time to go into all of the examples, indicate that because they accept the straitjacket of capitalism, they will not establish proper workers' rights. If you go back to the Labour government of 13 years under Blair and Brown, they didn't scrap a single fundamental anti-union law that had been introduced by the Tories of Maggie Thatcher. If you go a step further back, in the mid-90s, then the Labour Council of Glasgow threatened to jail strikers in the City Council. Or in 1977-78, when the Fire Brigades Union came out on strike, a Labour government used the troops against them. Or in 1964-70 Labour government of Harold Wilson, they introduced or tried to introduce what was called in place of strife legislation, straight from the Tory playbook, in order to ban the ability to take industrial action. And even the 1945-51 Labour government, often held up as some kind of socialist nirvana, is true that under the threat of revolution, actually, from below, then from above they carried out a number of radical reforms like the National Health Service, the welfare state, house building, council house building and so on. They did make all those concessions under the threat of upheaval post-war. But the same Labour government of Clement Attlee actually sent in the troops against dockers 5 days after they had been elected. And they did the same again, sending 21,000 troops against striking dockers in the autumn of 1945. And in fact, on 14 different occasions, they used troops against strikes on the docks, amongst lorry drivers, amongst gas workers and others. So Labour has a long and ignominious history of being anti-working class when it comes down to it, including the use of the state, troops included, against workers who dare to take collective action. That's my warning to people who are thinking of voting Labour, Starmer Labour, to get rid of the Tories. You need a real alternative, and that's why, although we can't afford to stand in all 57 seats, the Scottish Socialist Party is offering at least 150,000 voters a clean working class alternative that does stand up for workers' rights, that would scrap all the anti-union laws, that would ban all zero contracts, that would guarantee a 16-hour minimum working week for every worker that wants it, and so on, that would introduce a £15 an hour minimum wage for all workers aged 16 and above, which Labour point-blank refused to implement or pledged to implement, even though that's the demand of the entire trade union movement, a policy actually pioneered by the SSP. So I think it's time to waken up to the fact that there's two versions of Toryism on offer, and that the debate last night further proves that it's openly blue Tory or a pink respray of that in the form of a Starmer Labour government being offered. And whilst that's a very likely outcome because of hunger and desire and desperation to be rid of the Tories, a desire I share, of course, then we have to be warned. Labour will not stand up for the working class if or when they're elected. And we need a social opposition to that. And now's the time to prepare that and to close the gap, to help to fill the vacuum that the convergence of Labour and Tory are creating, to prevent right-wing racist demagogues like Nigel Farage filling that vacuum and distracting the working class from real solutions, dividing the working class and causing a vicious racist hostility towards ethnic minorities in the population. We need to be united with the rest of the working class to put up a socialist challenge for socialist change instead of these vicious alternatives.